In this video, we are going to go through how we use parentheses and brackets in MATLAB and some common mistakes that students make when they're using parentheses and brackets. Parentheses are used primarily for these three reasons. The first is when we're using our PEMDAS order of operations, so we can use parentheses to ensure that certain operations happen before other operations. For example, this x plus 5 divided by 2, we want to ensure that the x plus 5, so that x plus 5, all of that is divided by 2. If we did not use parentheses and we just typed out x plus 5 divided by 2, only the 5 would be divided by 2. So we can use parentheses in MATLAB to make sure that our order of operations is correct. Next is when we are defining inputs for a function. So anytime we use a function, with very few exceptions, after we write the function name, we are going to put parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, we're going to put whatever the inputs for that function are. Again, I said there are a few exceptions to this, which we might see throughout the class, but for the most part, most of our functions are going to have one or more inputs that we will enclose in parentheses. So for example, when we're using our zeros function that creates arrays of zeros, we would have zeros and then enclosed in parentheses are our inputs. The first input here is the number of rows of zeros. The second input here is the number of columns of zeros. And lastly, we use our parentheses when we are indexing. So when we are referencing a specific row and column or a specific index in an array, that's when we use parentheses. So we would put the array name, let's say A, and then enclosed in the parentheses would be our indices. Brackets or square brackets are used primarily for these three reasons. So the first is when we are building an array. So building an array from scratch and we're putting the numbers in to create that array. So if we wanted this array where we have 1, 2, 3 as the first row, 7, 8, 9 as the second row, we would enclose in square brackets those numbers 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 9, where we separate each value in the row by commas, and then to go to the next row we use a semicolon. We also use square brackets when we are concatenating arrays. Another word for concatenating is combining, or sometimes in this class you'll hear me say when we smush two arrays together. So if we have one array that's 5 values and the other array that's 6 values, and we want to combine that into one array that's 11 values, we could combine them this way. And whether or not we use a comma or a semicolon really depends on the sizes of A and B. And if we want to put them next to each other, we would use a comma. If we want to put them on top of each other, we would use a semicolon. When we're concatenating matrices, sometimes we make mistakes with the sizes of those matrices, in which case you get an error that says that the matrices being concatenated, that the sizes don't match, which we'll get into that later on, but just showing you that this is one reason we use square brackets. So anytime you want to combine two arrays together or smush two arrays together, you're going to use square brackets. Lastly, we use our square brackets when we have multiple function outputs. So for example, some functions like size can have two outputs. So size can have one output or size can have two outputs, and depending on how many variable names you put on the left hand side of the equals sign, size will output different things. And you can look at the help page for size to kind of look at all of your options there. But if we put two output variables on the left hand of the equal sign, we need them to be enclosed in brackets. And the way that this would work, it would find the size of A, and it would put however many rows are in A in the variable R, and however many columns are in A in the variable C. Some common errors that we have Number one error that I see with parentheses is not closing our parentheses. When you do this is called a syntax error. It will light up your code red. You'll have a little red line next to the line of code where you're having the problem. These are two examples, which maybe you're looking at that and saying, oh, of course those don't match. Of course that's missing a square bracket there. It's missing another parentheses here. But when we're coding, sometimes we have a lot of parentheses in one line, and it can be hard to make sure that they all match and that they all close. So that's, like I said, a very common mistake that you're going to see. Another mistake that I should have included here is closing our parentheses at the wrong place. So sometimes we have the correct amount of parentheses, they're all closed, but we have closed them in the wrong spot, which would create either a runtime error that when our code ran, we would get an error message, or a logic error where we would get an answer, but it's an answer different than what we expect. We can also use our another common error is when we use square brackets instead of parentheses. So for instance, trying to use square brackets when defining the input for a function will lead to an error. One other common error is using parentheses when we need brackets. For example, you cannot build an array this way. The way to build an array is using square brackets. These are some common error messages that you might see when you have a problem with your parentheses. If you see these error messages, you likely have a parentheses or bracket error, or there might be some other type of error. So one example is parse error at parentheses. Usage might be invalid MATLAB syntax. Another one is a parentheses, an open parentheses might be missing a closing parentheses, causing invalid syntax at the end of the line. And we'll look at different examples where we might get these. Lastly, invalid expression when calling a function or indexing a variable, use parentheses, otherwise check for mismatch delimiters. Which MATLAB error messages are not always straightforward. When I read this sentence as somebody who has used MATLAB for, oh my goodness, over a decade, this error message is not super straightforward. And when I read it, it's not super clear that I have an error with my parentheses. So that's why I'm trying to point these out to you now, that if you see this error, check that you are using the correct parentheses. So maybe you're using square brackets when you should be using parentheses, or maybe you're using parentheses when you should be using square brackets. And we'll get to MATLAB in just a second to go over these. One more common error is in math, and when we're using our calculators, when we're using our TI-83s or TI-84s, we can write x multiplied by 5 as just x parentheses 5. So when we're writing out our math homework, that's how we can write x multiplied by 5. That is not the case with MATLAB. To multiply with MATLAB, you always need the multiplication sign, which is the little star, shift 8. So to do x times 5, it would be 5 times x, or x times 5. You need that star. MATLAB does not understand what this means, or understands what that means, but it does not read this as multiplication. So the error you get from this, typing this, will really vary depending on what x is. So it might tell you that that you're trying to index something that's not there. It might tell you that your indices must be real positive integers. It just really varies, and we'll try to look at some examples of that. So let's practice with MATLAB. Let's first practice with our order of operations. Let's assume we are trying to write the equation 4 plus e to the 3 minus 1 divided by the cosine of pi plus 4. go ahead and write that down because I'm pretty sure as soon as I exit the drawing on this, it's going to disappear. So we have 4 plus e to the 3 minus 1 cosine pi plus 4. And this is great because we're going to get some practice with how we create e in MATLAB and how we do pi in MATLAB. So the way that we do e, or e to something, is using the exp function. So let's write help exp. And we see that exp of x is the exponential of the elements x, e to the x. So to write e to the 3, we would write exp parentheses 3 close parentheses. So we're going to enclose everything that's on the top of our parentheses. I'm going to make my font a little bit bigger for you. With a 4 plus exp of 3 minus 1. So that's everything that was on the top of my fraction, divided by, and we had the cosine of pi plus 4. So cosine is a function. And I know in math we can write cosine of pi and not use parentheses, but here in MATLAB we need parentheses. Cosine of, and what do we want to take the cosine of? Pi plus 4. Close parentheses. And we press enter, and this is the answer that we get. So in this case, we use two different functions, exp, which remember exp of 3 is e to the 3. Exp of some variable x is e to the x. So that's the top, and here's the bottom of our fraction, and cosine of pi. Pi is one of the very special kind of built-in functions in MATLAB that does not need parentheses. So if you type help pi, it does not need parentheses. You can just type pi by itself and it's stored into MATLAB. Cosine, we needed the parentheses to define the input. Let's say we wanted to create an array of zeros. We would use the zeros function. And if we could just use one number, and that would create a square array of whatever number we put in, an n by n array, or we can put multiple inputs. Here I'm going to put multiple inputs. I want 4 rows and 2 columns of zeros. Now let's say I wanted to put a 1 here on the second row, first column. I would say a to 1 in parentheses equals to 1. And that puts a 1 in the second row, first column of A. And there's another video about indexing where I go into more details about how indexing works. You can also use indices of an array on the right-hand side of your equation. So if we wanted to say that B is equal to whatever's in the third row, second column of A, so 1, 2, 3, third row, second column, that's going to be 0, then B is 0. For our square brackets, so we just created A. A has 1, 2, 3, 4 rows, 2 columns. Let's say we didn't know the size of A, which sometimes we'll have different inputs, or we'll be writing a function that needs to work for arrays of all the different sizes. And we want to figure out how many rows and how many columns are in A. We could use our size function. We could write whatever we want to call our variables. Let's say rows, columns equals size of A. So rows is going to be however many rows were in A, and cols is going to be however many columns is in A. We can also, I said we could concatenate matrices using square brackets. So if we had, so we already have A, and let's say we have C, which is, we're going to put it next to A, so it also needs to have 4 rows. Let's do ones. It has 4 rows, 1 column, times 7, so that's going to be 4 sevens. So ones creates a 4 by 1 array of ones, and then multiplied by 7 gives us an array of sevens. So we can concatenate the matrices by typing A, comma, C, and we see that we have A here, and next to A we have C. We can also use square brackets to concatenate more than 2 arrays, so we could put CAC, so this is C, this is A, and this is C. The last way to use square brackets that I mentioned is to create an array of just however many numbers we want. And we see that that created 4, 3, 1, 3, 5. A lot of the errors I see in MATLAB as our codes get harder and harder kind of go back to these basics of parentheses and indexing, which is why I'm taking so much time trying to make sure that we have a foundation in these basics, so that when we have to do harder things in MATLAB, these things are not causing problems for us.